So how do we work with difficult people? Find out on this episode of IncreMental Health Tips. Welcome to IncreMental Health Tips. My name is Jared, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Liz. Last week we discussed understanding difficult people, and this week we're going to be focused on how to deal with difficult people in the workplace specifically, because oftentimes the workplace is where we interact with difficult people, because oftentimes we don't necessarily choose who we interact with at the workplace. So this can be a really common source of these sorts of issues. So as you recall from last week, we discussed how understanding difficult people can really help you gain better perspective of how to interact and deal with them. But in the workplace, the dynamics can be a little bit different. So Liz, before we jump into it, I just want to raise that a lot of this input is going to depend on the type of workplace you have and what your relationship to the difficult person or people is. It is, dealing with a difficult customer, if you're in customer service, is different than dealing with a difficult colleague or a difficult supervisor, or etc. So keep in mind all of these suggestions should be viewed in a context of what your situation is, as not every thing we're going to mention is appropriate in every context or situation. So Liz, what would you say to someone who is having trouble with dealing with difficult people in their workplace?
So I think the first thing is to stay calm, even if you're dealing with someone who's yelling at you or being disrespectful. You try to stay as calm as you can. If you need to, try to step away from it, or at least emotionally step away from it, and try to understand what the person's intention is. What is causing them to be difficult? What's causing them to be angry? And that may mean that you need to set some boundaries, that, if you're dealing with a customer service person and you're dealing with a client who's yelling at you, asking them very directly, could you calm down so that I can help you?
Well, the person may not be angry. I come at this more from, you shouldn't take work personally. If a colleague points out a mistake that you've made, that's not something that you should feel is a personal attack. And if you are taking it that way, then you may want to examine your attitude. Of course, colleagues might attack you personally, and there might be some interpersonal dynamics, but make sure your attitude is correct, because that customer who might be giving you a hard time might not actually be upset at you, but might be upset at your company's policy. So all of this has a context, and it's important to consider it.
Yeah, and I do think this is where getting some perspective from others can be really helpful. Trying to understand, is this a company policy issue? And just getting a sense of what the root issue is. Most of the time, I find people are highest stressed when they take something personally, and they really don't need to take it personally. If it's company policy to do things in a certain way, that's not a reflection on you. It's just you're being asked to follow company policy. So being able to recognize those differences and understanding that it's not personal. If you're dealing with an angry client, they were probably angry before they ever talked to you. So recognizing that these things are not personal, even if someone is acting inappropriately, then it can help with being able to manage that situation and manage the emotions that come along with working with someone who's difficult.
Another aspect of that is knowing what your company policy actually is and what it says, because oftentimes company policy will address specific issues that you may be dealing with. And especially in the workplace, you always want to make sure that you're doing what you ought to do so you don't get in trouble or get blamed for something that you either shouldn't or you don't intend to happen. So knowing your policies is really important. Another aspect that I think comes into play is having proper boundaries between your work, your work and your personal life. I think that that's really important.
Yeah, another area of stress for people is when they don't have any sort of separation between their work and home life. So if you're working from home, your work might take over your entire house. So confining your workspace to a specific location, changing the clothes that you're wearing when you're working and when you're not working. So that way there's this physical separation between work life and home life can help make that transition easier and help to establish and separate work and home life. Also, you might need to, at the end of the day, make a to-do list for the next day. So that way you're able to stop thinking about work when you're finished work for the day.
Well, also situationally, as you're thinking about interacting with a difficult person, if that difficult person happens to be your supervisor, you might consider actually just listening and trying what they're suggesting and what they're saying. People usually have reasons for why they do things, and even if you can't seem to understand why they're suggesting a certain approach, you might try it out, because you never know that you might actually find that it's better. You might actually learn something by approaching something new.
Yeah, and I've learned a lot at my workplaces when I've tried something according to the way that my supervisor suggests. I find that it can get different results, and I can learn things from it that I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't tried it that way. So learning that different approaches can be effective for different reasons, or just even accepting that sometimes company policy is the way it is because the company has to consider a lot more factors than what individual workers have to deal with. And sometimes even company policy might not work, and it may need to be brought to the attention of the policymakers that a specific policy is ineffective, or there needs to be some flexibility with it. And so figuring out how to open up that conversation so that you can communicate your perspective as well as understanding the perspective of others, it can go a long way to being able to address these sorts of issues.
And ultimately, as you say, even if you don't like it, being able to get along with and deal with these people can ultimately help you exude influence and change the approach that they take in different ways. So it's important that if you don't like the environment or the situation at your workplace, you might consider what you can do to change it. Another really important thing, in a lot of workplaces, there's a lot of toxic cultural aspects where people engage in a lot of, the rumor mill, a lot of gossip, a lot of things like that. Avoid that sort of thing, and don't contribute to any sort of undermining, or even if you don't like the person you're working with or your boss, don't engage in negative ways to handle that situation, because ultimately that you can't control what happens to rumors or gossip, and getting involved with it just really isn't going to help anybody.
Yeah. And focusing on treating the person who you're talking to with respect, and also focusing on what you can take action on can really help with clarifying what your role is in the situation and what you can do to address the issue that needs to be addressed.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. But if you enjoy our content, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. And remember, until next time, even small steps can lead to big changes. We'll see you next time.